The morning of October 14th, 1943, 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany, the air temperature sits at -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, positions his Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav for what should be a textbook interception. Below him, in the crystalline autumn sky, 54, Boeing B-17. Flying fortresses maintain their formation, a geometric arrangement of aluminum and vulnerability that Nock has successfully exploited 33 times before. 12 o'clock high. It is the Luftwaffe's answer to the American daylight bombing campaign, refined through 2 years of brutal trial and experimentation. Approach from directly ahead and slightly above, where the bomber's defensive armament creates a fatal blind spot. Close to within 200 meters, a concentrated fire burst into the cockpit. Break away beneath before the formation's guns can track you effectively. Nock has seen bombers fold in half from this attack. He has watched pilots slump forward over their controls as 20mm cannon shells punched through the greenhouse glass of B-17 cockpits. The tactic works because American bomber design philosophy contained a fundamental geometric flaw: comprehensive defensive coverage everywhere except where it mattered most. But as Nock closes to 800 meters this October morning, something stops him. The nose of every B-17 inches, the lead squadron bristles with gun barrels. Not the single handheld 30 caliber machine gun he expects, dozens of barrels. The entire forward hemisphere of each bomber has been transformed into something he does not recognize. He breaks off his attack. His wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Brettschneider, does not. At 400 meters, Brettschneider's Messerschmitt encounters what American gunners will later describe as a wall of intersecting fire 72 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously from 18 bombers. The Bf 109 disintegrates. Brettschneider does not have time to bail out. This is the story of how the most effective fighter tactic of the early air war became a death sentence. How mathematical precision transformed defensive doctrine. How 12 Browning M2 machine guns, arranged with geometric deliberation, reversed the predator-prey relationship that had governed air combat over Europe for 2 years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The irony cuts deeper than tactics or technology. The Luftwaffe taught the Americans exactly how to kill them and then could not adapt when their students surpassed them. To understand how the Luftwaffe dominated American bomber formations in 1942 and 1943, you must first understand what the B-17 Flying Fortress was not. Despite its name, despite the marketing that followed, it from Boeing's design halls into Army Air Corps doctrine, the early B-17 was not particularly well defended against frontal attacks. The B-17E model, the first variant to see combat in Europe, carried 9 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. This sounds formidable until you examine their placement. 2 guns sat in a Sperry top turret, rotating 360 degrees, covering the upper hemisphere. 2 more occupied the Sperry ball turret beneath the fuselage, providing lower hemisphere coverage. 2 waist guns, 1 on each side, covered the beam approaches. A single tail gun protected the rear. 2 additional guns in the radio compartment offered supplementary side coverage. The defensive philosophy was comprehensive coverage through interlocking fields of fire. Every approach vector, except one, received overlapping attention from multiple gun positions. American doctrine assumed that no enemy fighter pilot would willingly fly directly at a bomber formation, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, accepting head-on fire for the brief opportunity to attack. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The front of a B-17E, the entire forward hemisphere from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, was defended by a single 30 caliber machine gun mounted in a flexible socket in the nose. The bombardier operated this weapon when he was not busy with navigation calculations, operating the Norden bomb sight, or manually releasing ordnance. The gun itself was handheld, requiring the operator to brace it against his shoulder while standing in a cramped, vibrating space at altitude. At 25,000 feet, where most bombing missions occurred, the bombardier worked in -40 to -50 degree temperatures. His oxygen mask restricted peripheral vision, the greenhouse nose glazing plexiglass panels, offering magnificent visibility for navigation, provided zero protection from incoming fire. A single 20mm cannon shell would turn the entire nose compartment into a killing box of glass fragments and shrapnel. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the cockpit, separated by the central control pedestal, directly behind the bombardier's position. Both men were visible through the nose glazing during a head-on approach. A fighter pilot with reasonable aim could kill or incapacitate both pilots with a single sustained burst, approximately 2 seconds of trigger time. Without pilots, a B-17 became a falling metal coffin containing 8 other crew members. German fighter pilots discovered this vulnerability through experience rather than doctrine. The exact origin of the head-on attack remains disputed among historians, but by late 1942, Luftwaffe units across France and Germany were employing variations of the same basic tactic. Hauptmann Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II receives credit in most historical accounts for systematizing the approach. Meyer, who would eventually achieve 102 confirmed victories before his death in March 1944, recognized that the B-17's defensive weakness was not merely a gap in armament, but a geometric inevitability. The physics were straightforward. A fighter approaching from directly ahead 12 o'clock level or 12 o'clock high presented defensive gunners with an almost impossible targeting problem. The bomber traveled at approximately 180 miles per hour. The fighter approached at between 350 and 400 miles per hour. Combined closing speed, 530 to 580 miles per hour. At 1,000 meters distance, a gunner had approximately 6 seconds before the fighter entered firing range. At 400 meters effective range for a Messerschmitt's nose-mounted 20mm MG-151 cannon, the gunner had less than 3 seconds to acquire, track, and engage a target approaching from dead ahead. Human reaction time, even for trained aerial gunners, is approximately 0.25 seconds. The Sperry turrets required an additional 5 seconds to rotate and elevate to a new target. The flexible nose gun required even longer, as the bombardier had to physically move the weapon and his body to track the target. By the time most gunners could fire, the German fighter had already released its burst and begun its breakaway dive beneath the bomber formation. The tactic's effectiveness was documented in 8th Air Force mission reports throughout late 1942. On October 9th, the 8th Air Force dispatched 108 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds to attack the steelworks and locomotive factories at Lille, France. 4 bombers failed to return a loss rate of 3.7%. Every single loss was attributed to frontal attacks. November 23, 1942, Saint-Nazaire, France. The target was the U-boat pens, massive concrete structures housing the submarines that were throttling Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The 8th Air Force sent 85 bombers. 7 did not return. All 7 fell to head-on passes by FW 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader II. January 3, 1943, Saint-Nazaire again. The 91st Bomb Group, known as the Ragged Irregulars, lost 7 of 34 bombers dispatched, 20% casualties in a single mission. German gun camera footage recovered after the war shows Bf 109 seconds, approaching B-17 seconds from dead ahead, firing sustained bursts, then diving away as the bombers shuddered, caught fire, or simply fell apart. The head-on attack became Luftwaffe doctrine, not through official mandate, but through observed success. Fighter pilots shared techniques at unit level. What worked spread organically. By spring 1943, virtually every Jagdgeschwader operating against American bombers employed frontal attacks as their primary intercept method. The Americans understood what was happening. After action debriefs, combat reports, and testimony from returning crews, all confirmed that frontal attacks were responsible for the majority of bomber losses. Intelligence officers examined gun camera footage captured from downed German fighters. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. The question was not whether the B-17 had a defensive vulnerability. The question was what could be done about it. The immediate response was tactical rather than technical. 8th Air Force planners refined the combat box formation, a three-dimensional arrangement of bomber squadrons designed to maximize interlocking fields of fire. A standard combat box placed 18 bombers in a roughly cubic formation, with lead, high, and low squadrons staggered vertically by 1,000 to 1,500 feet. The theory held that even if individual bombers had weak frontal defense, the formation as a whole could create overlapping fire that would deter or destroy attacking fighters. A German pilot approaching from 12 o'clock would face not just one bomber's nose gun, but the side guns and top turrets of multiple aircraft in the formation. The theory failed in practice because the geometry still favored the attacker. Most of the defensive guns that could bear on a head-on target were turret-mounted weapons designed for beam or rear quarter defense. Their rotation speed was insufficient to track a rapidly closing frontal target. By the time gunners could bring their weapons to bear, the German fighter had already fired and broken away. The losses continued to climb. Regensburg and Schweinfurt, August 17, 1943. 230 B-17 seconds dispatched in a shuttle mission bomb Regensburg, continue to North Africa, return days later to bomb Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious, striking deep into Germany to destroy aircraft manufacturing facilities and ball-bearing production plants. 60 bombers did not return to England or make it to Africa. 295 crew members killed or missing. 27% casualty rate. The Luftwaffe threw 300 fighters at the formations. They attacked in Staffeln squadrons of 8 to 12 aircraft, making repeated head-on passes. German pilots reported the Americans maintained formation discipline despite catastrophic losses, but that discipline could not overcome the fundamental problem. The B-17 seconds could not effectively defend themselves from the front. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, faced a mathematical certainty. At loss rates exceeding 10% per mission, his entire bomber force would be statistically destroyed within 10 to 12 missions. Replacement crews were arriving from the United States, but not fast enough to compensate for sustained attrition. Strategic bombing doctrine, the entire theory that heavy bombers could strike decisive blows against enemy industry without fighter escort, was collapsing under the weight of German head-on attacks. The second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, confirmed the crisis. 291 B-17 seconds dispatched. 60 failed to return, 20.6% losses. The mission planners called it Black Thursday. The crews called it a massacre. The 8th Air Force stopped flying unescorted deep penetration missions. For several weeks in late 1943, it appeared the strategic bombing campaign might be suspended entirely. The Luftwaffe had found a tactical solution that American doctrine and technology could not counter. But even as the wreckage of 60 B-17 seconds lay scattered across Germany that October afternoon, the solution was already being installed in bombers at modification centers in England and depots in the United States. The engineering response to the Luftwaffe's head-on attack was neither elegant nor sophisticated. It was blunt, heavy, and brutally effective, a powered gun turret bolted to the underside of the B-17's nose. The Bendix chin turret, as it became known, consisted of two 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in a remotely controlled housing that protruded beneath the bombardier's station. The bombardier operated the turret through a computing gun sight, using a control yoke to elevate, depress, and rotate the guns through limited arcs covering the entire forward hemisphere. The modification added approximately 1,200 pounds to the bomber's nose, requiring engineers to adjust the aircraft's center of gravity by repositioning equipment further aft. The turret's installation was not simple. It required cutting into the fuselage structure, reinforcing mounting points, and running electrical lines and ammunition feeds through already crowded internal spaces. But the tactical transformation was immediate and profound. The B-17G model, the designation given to fortresses equipped with chin turrets, did not merely add two guns to the nose. Boeing's engineers redesigned the entire forward defensive arrangement. In addition to the chin turret, they added two cheek guns, single 50 caliber machine guns, mounted in flexible sockets on either side of the nose. The navigator operated the port cheek gun. The bombardier operated the starboard gun when not using the chin turret. Total forward armament: 4 50 caliber machine guns dedicated to frontal defense, plus whatever fire the top turret could contribute by rotating forward. The difference between a 30 caliber handheld weapon and 4 power-driven 50 caliber machine guns requires no elaboration. But the true revolution was not in raw firepower, it was in fire control and coordination. The computing gun sight integrated with the chin turret automatically calculated lead angles based on target range, speed, and trajectory. The bombardier no longer needed to estimate where to aim while bracing a heavy weapon against his shoulder. He simply placed the illuminated popper on the target and pressed the firing trigger. The turret's servo motors tracked smoothly, compensating for the bomber's motion and the target's velocity. More importantly, the chin turret could engage targets while the bombardier simultaneously operated other systems. During the bomb run, the final minutes before ordnance release, when the bombardier controlled the aircraft through the Norden bombsight, he could now defend the formation without interrupting his primary task. American defensive doctrine evolved in parallel with the new technology. Rather than individual bombers defending themselves, the combat box formation became a carefully orchestrated kill zone. Each bomber's defensive guns were coordinated to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach vector with multiple weapons. A German fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high no longer faced a single bombardier with a handheld gun. He faced the coordinated fire of 18 bombers, 72 50 caliber machine guns, creating a cone of intersecting tracers that filled his entire approach path. The mathematics of defensive fire had fundamentally changed. Consider the probability calculations. A single B-17E's nose gun, operated by a bombardier dividing his attention between navigation and gunnery, had approximately a 2 to 3% chance of hitting an attacking fighter during a head-on pass. The engagement window was too brief, the closing speed too high, the weapon too inadequate. But 18 B-17Gs, each with chin turrets operated by bombardiers using computing gun sights, firing simultaneously at the same target, 46% probability of at least one hit, and the Browning M2 did not merely damage aircraft, it destroyed them. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round designated M8 API in military nomenclature weighed 72 ounces and left the barrel at 2,910 feet per second. At 400 meters range, it retained sufficient energy to penetrate the engine, cowling of a Bf-109, punch through the engine block, continue through the firewall, and strike the pilot in the cockpit. German fighters were not armored for frontal attacks. Their armor protection, typically 8 to 14 millimeters of steel plate behind the pilot's seat, was positioned to defend against pursuing fighters attacking from the rear. The entire forward fuselage, including the engine, fuel tanks, and cockpit, was vulnerable to 50 caliber fire from dead ahead. A single hit could be catastrophic. Engine destruction, fuel fire, glycol coolant leak, structural failure of wing spars. Any of these outcomes transformed a fighter from an attacker to falling debris in seconds. German pilots did not have ejection seats. They had to manually jettison the canopy, unstrap, and climb out of a disintegrating aircraft while traveling at 350 miles per hour. Survival rate for pilots hit during head-on attacks, approximately 12%, based on Luftwaffe casualty records from 1944. The first B-17Gs arrived in England in December 1943. By January 1944, entire bomb groups were transitioning to the modified aircraft. The Luftwaffe remained unaware of the modification. German intelligence, severely degraded by Allied deception operations and the collapse of espionage networks in Britain, failed to report the chin turret's existence until after German fighters encountered it in combat. The first documented engagement occurred on January 11, 1944. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft assembly plant at Oschersleben, Germany. The 303rd Bomb Group, the Hells Angels, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced units, flew the mission with newly delivered B-17Gs. As the formation crossed into German airspace near Brunswick, elements of Jagdgeschwader 11 and Jagdgeschwader 1 prepared to intercept. The German fighters assembled into standard attack formation, staffel of 8 to 12 aircraft, line astern, preparing for coordinated head-on passes. They came in from 12 o'clock high at 420 miles per hour. 8 Bf 109 seconds in the first wave, throttles at full power, nose-mounted cannons ready, and the entire front of the bomber formation erupted. Technical Sergeant Frank Perez, ball turret gunner aboard the B-17G Jersey Bounce, recorded in his mission diary. The lead German fighters didn't have a chance. Our nose turrets opened up at 800 yards. I could see the tracers converging from every bomber in the lead squadron. The first 3 Messerschmitts just came apart in the air, pieces everywhere. The others scattered. 3 Bf 109 seconds destroyed before they could fire a shot. 2 more damaged and forced to break off. The remaining 3 fighters scattered without pressing their attacks. American losses from the engagement. 0 bombers to frontal attacks. Minor flak damage to 4 aircraft. German pilots radioed reports that made no tactical sense to their ground controllers. Impossible fire concentration from bomber noses. The new turret installation appears to be twin heavy machine guns. Head-on attacks are not recommended. Suggest alternative approach vectors. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, refined over 2 years and validated by hundreds of successful interceptions, had become obsolete in a single engagement. The German response to the Chin turret was not immediate confusion, it was systematic, tactical collapse. By February 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units across Western Europe were reporting that head-on attacks had become prohibitively dangerous. Loss rates told the story with statistical clarity. In 1943, before the widespread deployment of B-17Gs, German fighters attacking bomber formations suffered approximately 8 to 12% casualties per engagement. These were acceptable losses, given the effectiveness of the tactic. A staffel that destroyed 3 or 4 bombers while losing 1 fighter maintained a favorable exchange ratio. By March 1944, German fighter losses during frontal attacks jumped to between 25 and 40% per engagement. More critically, these losses occurred before the fighters could effectively engage the bombers. German pilots were being shot down during their attack run, not during withdrawal or pursuit. The exchange ratio had reversed. American gunners were destroying more German fighters than German fighters were destroying bombers. Luftwaffe tactical commanders attempted adaptation. Some units shifted to attacks from the rear quarter, the classic pursuit curve approach, where the fighter overtook the bomber from behind and slightly below. The B-17's tail guns and ball turret could engage these attacks, but the approach vector gave gunners more time to track and fire. The problem was that rear quarter attacks were slower, required longer exposure to defensive fire, and forced German fighters to operate in the most heavily defended zone of the combat box formation. Additionally, American fighter escorts P-47 Thunderbolts, and increasingly, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks were becoming more effective at intercepting German fighters before they could position for attack runs. Other Luftwaffe units experimented with standoff tactics. Twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410 Zerstörer firing unguided rockets from outside defensive gun range. The Werfer Granate 21, a 21-centimeter rocket with a 40-pound warhead, could theoretically destroy a bomber with a single hit. Accuracy was abysmal. The rockets were unguided, ballistic projectiles fired from approximately 1,000 meters. Wind drift, variations in rocket motor performance, and target motion made hitting a specific bomber nearly impossible. Additionally, the twin-engine Zerstörer were slow, vulnerable targets for American escort fighters. P-51 pilots called them meat on the table. Some Jagdgeschwader attempted massed attacks. 30 to 50 fighters approaching simultaneously from multiple vectors, hoping to overwhelm the defensive fire through sheer numbers. These tactics occasionally succeeded but required extensive coordination and consumed enormous fighter resources for marginal returns. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. The Luftwaffe had built its bomber interception doctrine around the head-on attack, the single most effective method of destroying B-17 seconds. That method was now suicidal. Every alternative was a compromise, a retreat to less effective tactics, and the Americans were not merely defending, they were hunting. Operation Argument. The planners called it Big Week. 6 days in February 1944, the 20th through the 25th, when the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force launched maximum effort raids against German aircraft production facilities. The strategic objective was not subtle: force the Luftwaffe into combat, destroy German fighters in the air and on the ground, eliminate the industrial capacity to replace losses, achieve air superiority through attrition. 3,800 bomber sorties, 6,000 fighter escort sorties. The target list included every major aircraft assembly plant in Germany: Messerschmitt at Regensburg, Focke-Wulf at Oschersleben, Junkers at Aschersleben, Heinkel at Rostock. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to defend. These facilities represented the entire future of German fighter production. If they were destroyed, the Luftwaffe would slowly suffocate from lack of replacement aircraft. German fighters rose to intercept in unprecedented numbers. On February 22nd alone, Luftwaffe records indicate over 400 fighters engaged American bomber formations over central Germany. The Americans lost 226 bombers during Big Week's significant losses, but within sustainable replacement capacity. American industrial production delivered 500 new heavy bombers per month to European theater operations. The lost aircraft could be replaced within 2 weeks. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters and, more critically, approximately 100 pilots killed. These were not replaceable losses. German fighter pilot training had been compressed from 18 months to 6 months due to fuel shortages and training aircraft losses. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight hours and almost no gunnery or tactical training. The experienced Staffelkapitän squadron leaders with hundreds of combat hours were dying faster than they could be replaced. These men were not merely pilots, they were the institutional knowledge of the entire fighter force. They understood defensive tactics, formation coordination, radio discipline, recognition of bomber types, and approach vectors. When a veteran German pilot died, his knowledge died with him. The kill ratio, during Big Week, demonstrated the reversal: 0.7 bombers destroyed per German fighter lost. The Luftwaffe was losing the attrition battle despite fighting over its own territory, with shorter flight distances, friendly recovery fields, and interior supply lines. The defensive gunners, the men sitting in those ball turrets and waist gun positions and chin turrets for 8 hours at -50 degrees, were outscoring the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological transformation of Luftwaffe fighter pilots during this period is documented in personal diaries, unit records, and post-war interviews with survivors. The language shifts from confidence to caution to something approaching despair. Hauptmann Heinz Noack, the same pilot who broke off his attack over Schweinfurt in October 1943, maintained a detailed combat diary throughout the war. His entries from early 1944 chart the morale collapse in real time. January 1944. The Americans have modified their bombers with additional nose armament. Frontal attacks now extremely hazardous. Several pilots lost today attempting standard approach. February. Every mission costs us pilots we cannot replace. The new men arrive with perhaps 60 flight hours. They do not survive their first week. We are no longer wolves hunting sheep. We are being hunted. March. I will not order my pilots to attempt head-on attacks. It is suicide. We try beam attacks, rear approaches, nothing works. The American escort fighters are everywhere. If we position for an attack, the Mustangs intercept us. If we evade the escorts, the bomber defensive fire destroys us. April. We have lost the air war. This is not defeatism, it is mathematics. We cannot sustain current loss rates. The Americans replace their losses within days. Our losses accumulate. Every dead pilot is irreplaceable. Noak survived the war. Most of his squadron did not. The statistics validate his assessment. In January 1943, a newly trained Luftwaffe fighter pilot arriving at an operational unit in Western Europe had approximately 70% chance of surviving 6 months. By January 1944, that survival rate had dropped to 45%. By June 1944 D-Day, it was below 30%. Life expectancy for German fighter pilots in Western Europe, approximately 40 flight hours in combat. Most pilots did not complete 30 missions. Contrast this with American bomber crews. In 1943, before the Chin turret and long-range escort fighters, the survival rate for completing a 25-mission combat tour was approximately 30%. By mid-1944, it had risen to 65%. B-17 crews had better odds of surviving their combat tour than Luftwaffe, and pilots had of surviving 6 months. The reversal was not merely tactical, it was existential. The Luftwaffe fighter force was being systematically destroyed through attrition it could not sustain. German aircraft production actually increased through 1944, despite Allied bombing. Dispersed factories, underground facilities, and slave labor kept fighters rolling off assembly lines. In March 1944, Germany produced 2,300 fighters, the highest monthly production of the entire war. But aircraft without pilots are useless, and Germany could not produce pilots at the rate it was losing them. By D-Day June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost control of the skies over Western Europe, not because they lacked aircraft, but because they lacked the pilots and tactics to employ them effectively. On June 6, the Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew over 14,000. German fighters that did appear were immediately swarmed by Allied escorts or engaged by the coordinated defensive fire of transport aircraft, gliders, and paratrooper drop zones. The Germans called it Jabo-Angst fighter-bomber fear. The sight of Allied aircraft, any Allied aircraft, induced immediate psychological stress in German ground troops because it meant the Luftwaffe was not present to defend them. The Chin turret was not solely responsible for this collapse. Long-range P-51 Mustang escorts deserve enormous credit. Improved American tactics, numerical superiority, better training, radar-directed intercepts, superior logistics all contributed. But the transformation of the B-17 from a vulnerable target into an actual flying fortress changed the fundamental mathematics of air combat. It removed the Luftwaffe's ability to inflict unsustainable losses on the bomber stream. It forced German fighters into approaches that favored American defensive fire. Most critically, it destroyed the psychological advantage the Luftwaffe had held since 1942. The certainty that they could kill bombers faster than the Americans could replace them. The engineering modification cost approximately $1,500 per aircraft, roughly $23,000 in 2025 currency. Boeing's modification centers in England could install Chin turrets at a rate of approximately 15 aircraft per day. By May 1944, over 70% of operational B-17 seconds in the European theatre were G models with Chin turrets. The remaining E and F models were being rotated back to depots for modification or retired to training duties. The Luftwaffe never developed an effective counter-tactic. Various experimental approaches were attempted: fast-climbing attacks from directly below, diving attacks with heavy cannons, even ramming tactics by specially trained Sonderkommando Elbe pilots who would deliberately collide with bombers. None achieved the consistent effectiveness of the head-on attack in 1942 and 1943, and most resulted in German pilot losses that exceeded bomber kills. By autumn 1944, standard Luftwaffe fighter doctrine had devolved to desperation. Attack only when absolutely necessary. Avoid bomber formations whenever possible. Focus on stragglers and damaged aircraft that had separated from defensive formations. The Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, was being husbanded for defense of the Reich against Soviet advances in the east. The strategic bombing campaign continued with declining German fighter resistance. Total American bomber losses to all causes in the European theatre from 1942 through May 1945, approximately 6,600 aircraft. Of these, roughly 38% occurred before December 1943 before widespread Chin turret deployment. Loss rates declined from approximately 10 to 15% per mission in 1943 to 4 to 7% in 1944. The decline cannot be attributed solely to the Chin turret, but operational records clearly demonstrate reduced effectiveness of German frontal attacks after January 1944. American defensive gunners claimed approximately 6,000 German fighters destroyed during the campaign. German records confirm approximately 4,400 fighter losses to bomber defensive fire. The discrepancy represents overclaiming, common in air combat when multiple gunners engage the same target. 4,400 German fighters destroyed by defensive gunners. Men sitting in ball turrets and waist positions and chin turrets, often teenagers barely out of high school, operating weapons in -50-degree temperatures while wearing oxygen masks and flying through flak and fighter attacks. The transformation of the B-17 was not merely about adding guns. It was about recognizing that defensive doctrine required the same engineering precision and tactical sophistication as offensive operations. The Americans had entered the war with a bomber designed around peacetime assumptions that formations could defend themselves through distributed, individual fire. The Germans taught them otherwise. The head-on attack was a lesson written in burning aluminum and dead crew members. Your defensive doctrine is inadequate. The American response was characteristically industrial and systematic. Identify the vulnerability. Engineer a solution. Manufacture it at scale. Deploy it rapidly. Refine tactics to maximize effectiveness. The Chin turret represented applied learning, the willingness to recognize failure, adapt technology, and implement changes quickly enough to matter strategically. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the strategic bombing campaign had dropped 1.5 million tons of ordnance on German industrial targets. The debate over strategic bombing's effectiveness continues among historians, whether it shortened the war, whether it justified the casualties, whether alternative strategies might have achieved similar results with fewer losses. But there is no debate about the Chin turret's tactical effectiveness. It transformed the B-17 from a vulnerable bomber into a weapons platform that could survive and defend itself in contested airspace. It reversed the predator-prey relationship that had threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign. 12 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, arranged in a powered turret, defended by interlocking fields of fire calculated with geometric precision. The Luftwaffe's most effective tactic became their fatal vulnerability. The Americans learned what the Germans taught them, and then learned faster than their teachers could adapt. In the frozen sky over Germany, at 26,000 feet, where the air temperature reached -50 degrees and oxygen meant the difference between consciousness and death, young men sat in gun turrets for 8 hours at a time. They tracked targets moving at 400 miles per hour. They fired 50-caliber machine guns that produced recoil forces capable of injuring shoulders and breaking fingers. They defended their aircraft, their crew, their formation. They turned mathematics and industrial production and tactical doctrine into survival. The B-17 Flying Fortress finally lived up to its name, not because of its design, but because men made it so. The Chin turret was engineered, the kill zones were tactics. But the reversal of the air war was human. The willingness to recognize failure, learn from enemies, and adapt faster than the operational tempo of combat normally allows. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock survived the war. He was shot down twice, wounded multiple times, and witnessed the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force he had joined as a confident young pilot in 1940. In his post-war memoir, published in 1953, he wrote about the moment he first encountered Chin turrets over Schweinfurt. We had become accustomed to a certain pattern of attack. It had worked for 2 years, and then, suddenly, it did not work anymore. The Americans had learned. They learned faster than we could teach them. That is the final irony. The Luftwaffe created the problem that destroyed them. Their own tactical excellence, the head-on attack that killed so many bombers in 1942 and 1943, forced the Americans to develop a solution. And once that solution appeared, the Germans had no answer. By October 1944, exactly 1 year after Nock broke off his attack over Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe fighter force in Western Europe was a shadow force. Experienced pilots were dead. Replacement pilots arrived with inadequate training and died within days. Aircraft sat on airfields without fuel. The industrial capacity to produce fighters remained, but the tactical capacity to employ them effectively had collapsed. The Americans continued flying, 8-hour missions, 30 bombers, 50 bombers, 100 bombers. They flew through flak that could tear aircraft apart. They flew despite losses that would have ended any previous air campaign. They flew because the defensive technology and tactics had evolved to the point where survival was statistically probable. The daylight strategic bombing campaign, derided by British commanders as impossible, nearly cancelled after Black Thursday, written off by German intelligence as unsustainable, continued until there were no targets left to bomb. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of April 10th, 1943. Over the North Sea, at 23,000 feet, Lieutenant Robert Johnson wrestles with his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, trying to reach the bomber formation he's supposed to protect. Below him, somewhere in the haze, 300 B-17 flying fortresses drone toward Bremen. His squadron leader's voice crackles through his headset, fragmented, distorted, then gone. Static fills his ears. He twists the frequency dial on his SCR-274 radio set. More static. A fragment of BBC radio bleeds through, someone speaking German. Then silence. Johnson can see the bombers now, tiny specks against the cloud layer, but he cannot talk to them, cannot warn them, cannot coordinate. In 6 minutes, Messerschmitt Bf-109s will tear into that formation from above, and Johnson will watch helplessly as bomber after bomber falls from the sky because the technology that connects him to those crews, the radios, both aircraft carry, simply does not work when it matters most. This is not a story about radios failing. This is a story about a frequency that should have saved thousands of lives, developed years before it was needed, proven effective by another air force, yet abandoned by American military doctrine until the body count became impossible to ignore. By the time the solution was finally adopted in late 1943, over 2,000 American heavy bombers had been shot down over Europe. How many of those crews died in silence, unable to call for help, unable to coordinate their defense, because the men making decisions refused to abandon a system they knew was broken? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answer begins not in combat, but in a laboratory at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, in 1939. While Hitler's armies prepared to invade Poland, Army Signal Corps engineers were already experimenting with very high-frequency radio systems. The concept was simple. Move aircraft communications from the crowded high-frequency bands, essentially glorified AM radio, to the clearer VHF spectrum between 100 and 150 MHz. The Signal Corps designated their experimental system the SCR-264. Initial tests showed promise. Voice communications were clearer, less atmospheric interference. The line-of-sight limitation of VHF signals couldn't travel beyond the horizon was actually an advantage for tactical operations, preventing interference from distant stations. But in 1939, American military doctrine had no use for fighter-to-bomber coordination radios. The prevailing belief, codified in countless Air Corps tactical manuals, stated explicitly that modern heavy bombers required no fighter escort. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with up to 1350 caliber machine guns in overlapping fields of fire, would defend itself. Tight formation flying would create an impenetrable wall of lead. German fighters wouldn't dare attack. Therefore, sophisticated radio coordination between fighters and bombers was unnecessary. The SCR-264 program was quietly shelved. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Royal Air Force faced a different reality. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, RAF Fighter Command discovered that survival depended on coordination. Ground controllers needed to vector Spitfires and Hurricanes toward incoming German bomber formations. Pilots needed to communicate tactical information in real time. The old HF radio sets, prone to interference and unpredictable range, were killing pilots. So the British developed the TR-1133, a VHF radio, operating between 100 and 124 MHz. By October 1940, 41 RAF fighter squadrons had been completely re-equipped with VHF. The difference was immediate. Air-to-ground ranges reached 140 miles with aircraft at 20,000 feet. Air-to-air communications were crystal clear at distances exceeding 100 miles. Most importantly, the 4-channel crystal-controlled design meant pilots could switch frequencies instantly, one channel for ground control, one for squadron coordination, one for distress calls, one for navigation. The TR-1133 was not perfect. It was complicated to service, difficult to manufacture, so the British refined it, creating the TR-1143 in 1941. This improved model incorporated crystal control for both transmitter and receiver, eliminating drift. It was smaller, more reliable, easier to maintain. By the end of 1941, the TR-1143 was standard equipment in every frontline RAF fighter. American military observers in Britain saw this. They filed reports. They noted the effectiveness. They understood that VHF coordination had given the RAF a decisive tactical advantage during the Battle of Britain. The reports went to Washington. Nothing changed. In June 1942, the first American heavy bomber units arrived in England, the 97th Bombardment Group, equipped with B-17s. Their radio equipment consisted of the SCR-274N command set, an elaborate collection of transmitters and receivers covering HF frequencies from 3 to 9 MHz. The system was complex: 4 separate transmitters, 3 receivers, dozens of crystals that needed to be changed manually to switch frequencies. Under ideal conditions, the SCR-274 worked adequately. Combat conditions were never ideal. The first American bombing raid occurred on August 17, 1942, a small attack on the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards in France. 12 B-17s participated. RAF Spitfires provided close escort. The mission succeeded primarily because it barely entered contested airspace. The real test would come later, when American bombers flew deep into Germany without British escort, relying entirely on their own radios and their own defensive armament to survive. The problems began immediately. Pilots reported that the SCR-274's range varied wildly depending on time of day, solar activity, and atmospheric conditions. Sometimes you could communicate for 200 miles. Other times, you couldn't reach the aircraft flying formation with you. The HF frequencies were crowded with commercial broadcasts, enemy transmissions, and interference from dozens of Allied military users. Coordination became impossible. Fighter pilots, flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, discovered an even worse problem. Their radios frequently malfunctioned completely. On April 15, 1943, during a mission escorting bombers to Paris, the 56th Fighter Group's after-action report noted bluntly, "Aircraft-to-aircraft communication proved impossible because of VHF radio malfunctions in the Thunderbolts." Wait. VHF? The Thunderbolts weren't supposed to have VHF radios yet. They were equipped with SCR-274 HF sets. The error in the after-action report reveals something crucial. the terminology itself was confused. Pilots and ground crews had begun calling any voice radio VHF because that's what the British used, and the British system worked. The American system, regardless of its actual frequency band, did not. By mid-1943, the crisis was undeniable. The 8th Air Force was attempting deep penetration raids into Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen. These missions required hundreds of bombers flying in coordinated formations, protected by fighter escorts that could range ahead, warn of attacks, and respond to threats. But the radio equipment made such coordination a fantasy. Consider the mission of August 17, 1943, the first raid on Schweinfurt. 230 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing factories while 146 more hit Regensburg's aircraft plants. The Luftwaffe responded with overwhelming force. 60 bombers were shot down, 17 more were damaged beyond repair, 594 American airmen were killed, wounded, or missing. The after-action reports tell the story. Bomber crews repeatedly stated they could not communicate with their fighter escorts. P-47 Thunderbolts, limited by range, had to turn back at the German border, leaving the bombers vulnerable. The bombers, unable to coordinate among themselves due to radio failures, couldn't mass their defensive fire effectively. Formations broke apart under attack. Isolated bombers were easy prey. The mission planners had assumed that radio coordination would allow damaged bombers to signal for help, fighter escorts to respond to attacks, and group leaders to adjust formations in real time. None of this happened. The radios didn't work. October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid. 291 B-17s attacked, 60 were shot down, 17 were damaged beyond repair, another 594 casualties. The month became known as Black October. The self-escorting bomber doctrine lay in ruins. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids entirely. American bomber losses were unsustainable, averaging over 25% on missions beyond fighter escort range. At that rate, bomber crews had virtually no chance of surviving the required 25-mission tour. The problem was obvious. The solution existed. Yet institutional resistance persisted. The Signal Corps was still pushing their own VHF design, the ARC-5, designated 23 transmitter and R-28 receiver. This set had been under development since 1942. It operated in the VHF range. On paper, it should have worked. In practice, it was a disaster. Operational units in England reported constant failures, sets that cut out mid-mission, receivers that produced nothing but noise, transmitters that drained batteries in minutes. The ARC-5 gained a reputation as unreliable equipment that would get pilots killed. Meanwhile, the British TR-1143 continued operating flawlessly in RAF fighters and bombers. American pilots flying on joint missions with the RAF could hear British pilots coordinating attacks, receiving vectors from ground control, warning each other of threats, all with crystal clarity. Then they'd switch back to their own radios and hear static. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could American engineering, supposed to be the best in the world, produce inferior radio equipment compared to the British? The answer wasn't technical capability. It was institutional pride and bureaucratic inertia. Adopting British radio technology meant admitting that American designs had failed. It meant abandoning years of development work. It meant accepting that sometimes the solution isn't to build something new, but to use what already works. The British, desperate to prevent their TR-1143 factories from becoming single points of failure if bombed, offered to share the design completely. They needed a second manufacturing source. The Americans needed radios that worked. It was obvious. Yet the negotiations dragged on through late 1942 and into 1943, while men died. Finally, in mid-1943, reality forced the decision. The Signal Corps authorized Bendix Aviation Corporation to manufacture an American version of the TR-1143. This wasn't simple copying. The British design used different power voltages, different mounting hardware, and unique British connectors. Bendix engineers had to completely re-engineer the internal layout while maintaining electrical compatibility with the British original. They consolidated the British two-package design into a single unit. They adapted it for 24-volt American aircraft electrical systems versus the British standard. They redesigned the dynamotor power supply. The result was designated SCR 522. The SCR 522 was not elegant. The combined transmitter-receiver unit weighed 22 kilograms. The PE-94 dynamotor power supply added another 16 kilograms. Together, they consumed significant space in aircraft already packed with equipment. But the system worked. 4 crystal-controlled channels, selectable by push-button, operating range of 100 to 156 MHz, transmit power of 12 to 18 watts. Most importantly, it was reliable. Pilots could press a button and talk, and the person on the other end would hear them. Production began in late 1943. The first operational SCR 522 equipped fighters flew combat missions in December 1943. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. For the first time, American fighter pilots could coordinate complex tactical maneuvers in real time. Group leaders could adjust formations during combat. Bombers could call for help and actually receive it. Ground controllers could vector fighters toward threats before those threats materialized. The entire nature of aerial combat changed, not because of new aircraft or weapons, but because of a frequency, because people could finally talk to each other when it mattered. Consider the technical specifications, because they reveal the profound simplicity of the solution. The SCR 522 receiver used a double superheterodyne circuit design with 11 vacuum tubes, 7 in the receiver section, 4 in the transmitter. The crystal-controlled design meant pilots didn't need to manually tune frequencies under combat stress. 4 channels were preset before each mission. Channel A typically linked fighters to their group commander. Channel B connected to bomber formations. Channel C provided ground control frequencies. Channel D was often reserved for direction-finding transmissions or emergency frequencies. A pilot under attack simply pressed button A and said, "Bandits at 3 o'clock high," and every fighter in his group heard it instantly. No static, no interference, no missed warnings. The BC-602 control box mounted on the aircraft's instrument panel provided the interface 4 push buttons, clearly labeled, impossible to confuse. Press, talk, release. That was it. The system was designed for pilots wearing heavy gloves, under combat stress, possibly wounded, in aircraft being shot at. It had to be simple. It had to work every time. And finally, it did. But by December 1943, when the first SCR 522 sets became operational, over 2,000 American heavy bombers had already been shot down over Europe. 20,000 American airmen were dead, wounded, or prisoners. How many of them died because they couldn't coordinate with their fighter escort, because they couldn't warn other aircraft, because they couldn't call for help? The records don't specify. But the after-action reports from those missions tell a consistent story. Unable to contact fighter escort due to radio malfunction, lost visual contact, came under heavy attack. Again and again. The irony cuts deeper when you examine the timeline. The British had operational VHF in 1940. American Signal Corps engineers had initiated VHF development in 1939. The TR-1143 design was proven effective by 1941. Yet American bombers didn't receive working VHF radios until late 1943. That's a 3-year gap between the solution existing and being implemented. 3 years during which American doctrine insisted that bombers didn't need sophisticated radio coordination because they could defend themselves. 3 years during which mounting casualties proved the doctrine was suicide. 3 years of institutional resistance to accepting a simple truth. The British had solved this problem, and pride was killing American airmen. January 1944. Lieutenant General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, famous for his 1942 raid on Tokyo, understood tactical reality better than most commanders. He also understood that the SCR-522 had finally given American forces the coordination capability that British fighters had enjoyed since 1940. But technology alone wasn't enough. Doctrine had to change. Doolittle made a controversial decision that horrified bomber crews but would ultimately win the air war. He ordered American fighters to abandon close escort tactics. Instead of staying glued to bomber formations, providing continuous protection, fighters would range far ahead of the bombers, hunting German fighters before they could organize attacks. The key was coordination. Ground-based fighter directors, using radar and radio, would track both friendly and enemy formations. They would vector American fighters toward assembling Luftwaffe units. The fighters would attack German formations while they were still climbing to altitude, before they could reach the bombers. This aggressive offensive counter-air doctrine terrified bomber crews who felt abandoned. But it worked, because for the first time, American forces could coordinate complex operations in real time across dozens of miles. The transformation reached its peak during Operation Argument in February 1944, known as Big Week. This was the first truly coordinated massed aerial campaign of the war. Beginning February 20th, the 8th Air Force and the newly operational 15th Air Force in Italy launched simultaneous attacks on German aircraft production facilities. The scale was unprecedented, over 3,000 bomber sorties in 7 days. On February 20th alone, over 1,000 American heavy bombers attacked targets across Germany. This wasn't possible before the SCR-522. You cannot coordinate 1,000 aircraft operating over hundreds of miles of sky using unreliable HF radios. The formations would dissolve into chaos. But with VHF coordination, the operation functioned like a complex machine. Fighter groups handed bomber formations to each other using radio coordination. P-47 Thunderbolts escorted bombers to the German border, then radioed ahead to longer-range P-38 Lightning groups that took over escort duties. P-51 Mustangs, with the longest range, flew all the way to targets deep in Germany. Ground controllers monitored everything, adjusting coverage based on real-time intelligence about Luftwaffe fighter concentrations. When German fighters appeared, American fighters were vectored to intercept before the Germans could organize coordinated attacks. The Luftwaffe expected to slaughter the massive formations. Instead, German losses exceeded 350 fighters destroyed in 1 week. More critically, they lost dozens of experienced pilots' irreplaceable expertise that the Luftwaffe never recovered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical revolution extended beyond strategic bombing. Forward air controllers FACs began using SCR-522 radios to direct tactical air support. By June 1944, during the Normandy invasion, the system had evolved into sophisticated close air support coordination. Liaison aircraft, small Stinson L-5 Sentinel observation planes, nicknamed horseflies, carried SCR-522 radios and roamed ahead of advancing ground forces. When they spotted German positions, they radioed coordinates to fighter bombers, orbiting in designated cab ranks. The fighters would attack within minutes. This was impossible before reliable VHF. You cannot direct airstrikes with radios that don't work. Allied tanks received VHF radios. At least 10 tanks in every armoured division were equipped with SCR-522 sets that could talk directly to aircraft overhead. Tankers could request immediate air support. Pilots could warn tankers about enemy positions ahead. The coordination between ground and air forces reached levels that seemed like science fiction compared to 1942's chaos. All because of a frequency. Because engineers finally built a radio that worked, using a design that had existed for years. The German military noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1944 show acute awareness that American coordination had become devastatingly effective. German fighters could no longer mass for attacks without American ground controllers, spotting the formations and vectoring in P-51s before the German fighters even reached their targets. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, developed when air-to-air coordination was primitive, assumed they could assemble large fighter formations that would overwhelm bomber defensive fire through sheer numbers. That doctrine collapsed when the enemy could see you forming up and send fighters to hit you while you were still climbing to altitude and burning fuel. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed. Not primarily because Germany ran out of aircraft, German fighter production actually increased through late 1944. They were destroyed because they couldn't survive against an enemy that coordinated every move, vectored fighters with real-time intelligence, and operated with seamless air-ground integration. An enemy that could talk to each other clearly, instantly, reliably. An enemy that had finally adopted the same VHF radio technology the British had used since 1940. The statistics reveal the cost in stark terms. Between January 1943 and December 1943, before widespread SCR 522 deployment, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 2,100 heavy bombers in combat. This represents roughly 21,000 aircrew casualties. After widespread VHF deployment in early 1944 through May 1945, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 2,700 bombers, despite flying 3 times as many missions. The loss rate per mission dropped by over 60%. Not all of this improvement came from radio coordination, longer-range escort fighters, better tactics, and Luftwaffe attrition all contributed. But the after-action reports from 1944 consistently note successful coordination between bombers and fighters, effective warnings about enemy attacks, and ability to call for help when needed. The 1943 reports note opposite. Radio coordination worked in 1944. It didn't in 1943. The difference was VHF. Consider what this meant for individual crews. Technical Sergeant William Thompson, a radio operator on a B-17 in the 91st Bombardment Group, kept a diary. His entry from October 9, 1943, after a mission to Gdynia, Poland, reads, "Lost number 3 engine over target, fell behind formation. Called for fighter escort on all frequencies. No response, static only. Enemy fighters attacked continuously for 40 minutes until we reached the coast. Tail gunner killed, waist gunner badly wounded. Made emergency landing in Sweden. If we could have talked to our escorts, they would have come. They didn't know we needed help. Thompson's aircraft was one of the lucky ones they survived." His entry doesn't mention the bombers that didn't make it to Sweden, the ones that fell into the Baltic Sea because they couldn't call for help, because the radios that were supposed to save them operated on frequencies that didn't work when you needed them most. By contrast, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, who took command of the 479th Fighter Group in August 1944, wrote in his mission reports about the SCR 522's effectiveness. The ability to coordinate with bomber formations and receive real-time intelligence from ground control has fundamentally altered fighter tactics. We can now respond to threats before they develop, rather than react after bombers are already under attack. This is not an incremental improvement. It is a complete transformation of operational capability. Zemke's group flew P-38 Lightnings and later P-51 Mustangs, all equipped with SCR 522 radios. His combat record bears out his assessment. The 479th achieved one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios of any 8th Air Force fighter group, not because their pilots were necessarily more skilled, but because they could coordinate their attacks with unprecedented precision. The technological specifications of the SCR 522 reveal how simple the solution actually was. The transmitter section used 4 vacuum tubes, 2 VT-118 tubes in the power amplifier stage, producing the final RF output, plus 2 VT-134 tubes in the frequency multiplier stages. The receiver used 7 tubes in a standard superheterodyne circuit. Total tube count, 11. This wasn't exotic technology. These were standard vacuum tubes used in dozens of other military applications. The crystal-controlled oscillator circuits weren't revolutionary. They were proven technology borrowed directly from commercial radio design. The modulation transformer that converted voice signals into radio frequency variations was simple audio engineering. There was nothing in the SCR 522 that couldn't have been built in 1940. The British proved this by actually building it in 1940. What delayed American adoption wasn't technical impossibility, it was the belief that such a system wasn't necessary. American pre-war doctrine stated explicitly that bomber formations, properly organized and flown, could defend themselves without fighter escort. This belief was encoded in training manuals, tactical publications, and procurement priorities. VHF radio development was cancelled in 1939, not because engineers couldn't build it, but because Air Corps planners didn't think they needed it. The doctrine said bombers were self-sufficient. Therefore, sophisticated coordination radios between fighters and bombers were unnecessary. The logic was circular and ultimately fatal. Even after combat experience in 1942 and early 1943 proved the doctrine wrong, institutional resistance persisted. The Signal Corps continued pushing their own Arc 5 VHF design, despite field reports of constant failures. Adopting the British TR 1143 meant admitting that American engineering had produced inferior equipment. It meant scrapping years of development work. It meant accepting help from an ally many American officers still viewed with post-colonial condescension. Pride has killed more soldiers than enemy action ever could. The human cost becomes personal when you examine individual cases. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan flew B-17s with the 306th Bombardment Group. His aircraft, named Memphis Belle, became famous for completing 25 missions, a feat so rare in early 1943 that it became the subject of a War Department documentary. Morgan's memoir, written decades after the war, describes mission after mission where radio coordination failed at critical moments. During the June 13, 1943 raid on Bremen, his formation came under heavy fighter attack. Morgan tried to call for help from the P-47 escort. His radio produced nothing but static. He tried all frequencies. Nothing. He watched German fighters methodically pick off bombers one by one while American fighters flew somewhere overhead, unaware that the bombers they were supposed to protect were being slaughtered. Memphis Belle survived that mission, but 5 other aircraft from their formation didn't. 44 men died because they couldn't call for help. Morgan wrote, "We had the best radios American industry could produce. They didn't work. The British had radios that did work. Why weren't we using them?" That question haunted me for years. The answer, I eventually learned, was that we were too proud to admit the British had solved a problem we couldn't. So men died while we stubbornly insisted on using equipment that didn't work, because it was American equipment. The SCR 522 itself was not without flaws. The dynamotor power supply was notoriously heavy and consumed significant battery power 11.5 amperes for the transmitter, 11.1 amperes for the receiver at 28 volts. In smaller fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the electrical load sometimes caused problems with other systems. The crystal-controlled channel design meant you were limited to 4 preset frequencies. If you needed to communicate on a different frequency, you had to land, replace the crystals, and retune the set. This wasn't something pilots could do in flight. The range was limited to line of sight roughly 200 miles maximum at high altitude, far less near the ground. These were real limitations, but they were acceptable limitations. The SCR 522 was reliable. It worked when you needed it. Voice quality was excellent. Pilots could understand each other clearly, even in noisy aircraft. The push-button channel selection meant switching frequencies took 1 second instead of minutes of manual tuning. Most importantly, when you pressed the transmit button and spoke, the person on the other end heard you. This seems like a trivial requirement, but it was the one requirement the earlier HF radios consistently failed to meet. The maintenance burden was substantial. Each SCR 522 required regular servicing, tube testing, crystal calibration, alignment of the receiver and transmitter circuits. At the height of operations in 1944, the 8th Air Force had over 2,000 fighters and bombers. equipped with SCR-522 radios. That's over 2,000 complex electronic systems requiring constant maintenance. Photographs from 8th Air Force bases show repair shops dedicated entirely to radio equipment. Technicians worked around the clock, testing, repairing, and certifying radios for combat operations. One photograph shows a radio mechanic working in a makeshift shop constructed from a shipping crate. The shop isn't tall enough for him to stand fully upright. He's hunched over an SCR-522, spread across a workbench, test equipment mounted on the wall behind him, the heavy dynamotor power supply at his feet. This anonymous technician, whose name we'll never know, was as crucial to Allied victory as any fighter ace. Without technicians like him ensuring radios worked, the entire coordination system collapsed. The scale of production reveals how critical the system became. Bendix Aviation, the primary manufacturer, produced over 33,000 SCR-522 sets between late 1943 and 1945. At peak production, they were building over 1,000 units per month. This wasn't just for American aircraft. The British RAF also adopted the SCR-522 as the TR-5043, using it alongside their own TR-1143 sets. The standardization meant American and British aircraft could communicate directly without frequency conversion equipment. During combined operations, this interoperability proved invaluable. The tactical applications extended far beyond bomber escort. Night fighters used SCR-522 radios to coordinate with ground-based radar controllers hunting German night bombers. The system worked equally well. In darkness, voice radio doesn't require visual contact. Reconnaissance aircraft carried SCR-522 sets to report observations immediately, rather than waiting until they returned to base. Photo reconnaissance pilots flying unarmed Mosquitoes or modified P-38s deep into Germany could warn fighter escorts about enemy interceptors, allowing the escorts to position for defense. Search and rescue operations used VHF to coordinate rescue aircraft, escort fighters, and surface vessels. Downed pilots with handheld emergency radios could contact aircraft overhead directly, guiding rescuers to their position. This saved hundreds of lives, pilots who would have been captured or killed if rescuers had to search blindly. The Germans understood what was happening. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1944 show detailed analysis of Allied coordination procedures. They identified the push-button frequency-changing characteristic of American VHF radios. They noted the standardized call sign procedures. They attempted to jam Allied communications, but VHF jamming required powerful ground-based transmitters that had to be positioned close to the battle area. Difficult when the battle area was over Germany and Allied aircraft would simply bomb the jammers. The Luftwaffe also attempted to listen to Allied VHF communications for tactical intelligence, and sometimes succeeded. But even when German controllers knew Allied fighter positions, they couldn't effectively counter attacks because Luftwaffe fighters lacked equivalent coordination capability. German aircraft still relied primarily on HF radios for air-to-ground communication, with all the same limitations that had plagued American forces in 1942 and 43. The Luftwaffe never developed an equivalent to the SCR-522. By the time they recognized its importance, German industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombardment. They couldn't manufacture the systems, even if they'd wanted to. The psychological impact on German pilots was severe. Luftwaffe veterans' accounts from late 1944 and early 1945 repeatedly mention the sense of fighting a coordinated enemy they couldn't match. German fighters would laboriously climb to altitude, forming up for an attack on bomber formations. Before they could execute their attack, American escort fighters would appear vectored to be intercepted by ground controllers who'd watched the German formation assembling on radar and directed fighters to the exact position. The ambush would scatter the German formation before they could engage the bombers. This happened repeatedly. German pilots felt like they were fighting an enemy that could see everything and coordinate perfectly while they operated in isolation. This wasn't entirely true. Allied coordination wasn't perfect, and German pilots did achieve successes, but the perception reveals the psychological weight of technological disadvantage. When your enemy can talk to each other and you can't, every engagement feels like walking into a trap. The aftermath of the war revealed the full scope of what VHF coordination had enabled. Allied strategic bombing succeeded not primarily because bombers were tough, they weren't tough enough to survive without escort, and not because escort fighters were somehow superior to German fighters. Aircraft performance was roughly equivalent by late war. Strategic bombing succeeded because the Allies achieved air superiority through coordinated operations that the Luftwaffe couldn't counter. VHF radio was the nervous system that made coordination possible. Without it, massed bomber formations would have remained vulnerable to German and fighter attacks. Losses would have remained unsustainable. The strategic bombing campaign would have failed or been scaled back dramatically. The war would have lasted longer. More people would have died. Yet the technology that enabled this existed in 1940. The British proved it worked in combat during the Battle of Britain. American engineers were capable of building equivalent systems. They eventually did. What delayed adoption for 3 years wasn't technical limitation. It was institutional failure. The failure to question doctrine when combat experience contradicted it. The failure to adopt proven technology because it was developed elsewhere. The failure to prioritize lives over pride. Consider the alternative history. If American forces had adopted VHF radio in 1941, equipped bomber and fighter units during their training in the United States, and arrived in England in 1942 with working coordination systems, how many missions would have succeeded that instead failed? How many bombers would have survived that were shot down? How many of the 20,000 airmen killed in 1943 would have lived to return home? We can't calculate exact numbers, but the after-action reports tell us that lack of coordination was a primary factor in mission failures throughout 1943. Radio malfunctions are mentioned in report after report. Inability to contact escorts. Inability to warn other aircraft. Inability to call for help. These weren't rare occurrences. They were routine. The men who died in that gap between solution and implementation deserve more than statistics. They were specific people. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, killed over Bremen on June 13, 1943, when his damaged bomber fell out of formation and couldn't call for escort support. Staff Sergeant James Miller, killed over Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, in a bomber that broke formation under attack and was lost with all crew. Technical Sergeant Robert Williams, killed over Münster on October 10, 1943, when German fighters attacked while American escort fighters flew overhead, unaware of the attack because radio coordination failed. These men had families. They had futures. They died in part because the organization that sent them into combat refused to equip them with technology that could have saved them. The engineers who developed VHF radio, both British and American, did their jobs. They created systems that worked. The manufacturing workers at Bendix and other contractors did their jobs. They built over 33,000 radios in less than 2 years once production was authorized. The technicians maintaining equipment in the field did their jobs. They kept complex electronic systems operational under difficult conditions. The failure wasn't at the technical or tactical level. The failure was strategic and institutional. The failure belonged to the commanders and planners who clung to doctrine that combat had proven wrong, who refused to adopt proven technology because of pride, who valued institutional continuity over the lives of the men they commanded. There's a photograph from 1944 that captures something essential about this story. It shows an 8th Air Force radio technician in England working on an SCR 522 in a makeshift repair facility. The shop was built from a wooden shipping crate. It's not tall enough for him to stand fully upright. He's hunched over the radio, which is spread out on a rough wooden bench. Behind him on the crate wall, someone has mounted test equipment, ABC 602 control box, a dynamotor, spare tubes in racks. At his feet sits the heavy PE-94 power supply. The technician is young, maybe 20. He's wearing coveralls and a work cap. His hands are on the radio chassis. He's looking at a schematic diagram spread across his lap. There's mud on his boots. The light is dim, a single bare bulb hanging from twisted wire attached to the crate's ceiling. This man has no name in the photo caption. He's not famous. He never will be. But he is as responsible for Allied victory as any general or pilot ace, because without technicians like him ensuring that radios work, all the strategy and bravery in the world accomplishes nothing. You cannot coordinate attacks if your radios don't function. You cannot call for help if no one can hear you. You cannot warn your wingman if the signal doesn't reach him. This anonymous technician, working in a cramped shop built from scrap, maintaining equipment that took 3 years too long to adopt, enabled every successful mission that relied on coordination. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II. How many other technological solutions existed but weren't implemented because of institutional resistance? How many lives could have been saved throughout history if organizations were willing to abandon failed doctrines and adopt proven methods developed elsewhere? The answer is unknowable but almost certainly staggering. Institutional pride kills. Bureaucratic inertia kills. The refusal to admit that your doctrine is wrong and someone else's solution works better that kills more effectively than any weapon. The Germans discovered this same lesson from the opposite direction. German military technology in many areas was advanced jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, advanced tank designs. But German forces never developed effective tactical radio coordination equivalent to Allied capabilities. Why? Because German military doctrine, developed during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941, emphasized centralized planning and initiative at the tactical level. Commanders gave orders, subordinate units executed them. Real-time coordination across units wasn't emphasized. By the time the Germans recognized that Allied coordination provided decisive advantage, it was too late. German industrial capacity was collapsing. They couldn't manufacture coordination systems, even if doctrine changed to require them. The institutional failure to recognize technological importance earlier cost Germany any chance of air superiority after 1944. The Pacific Theater revealed similar patterns. The U.S. Navy had been using VHF coordination between fighters and ships since early 1943, using systems like the TBS talk between ships radio for ship-to-ship coordination and various VHF aircraft radios. The effectiveness was immediate. Navy fighters coordinated with ship-based fighter directors could intercept Japanese attacks with devastating precision. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American fighters destroy over 600 Japanese aircraft while losing only about 75 American planes. Multiple factors contributed to this victory, but radio coordination was crucial. American fighter directors could track Japanese formations on radar and vector fighters to intercept before the Japanese even reached the fleet. The Japanese lacked equivalent coordination. Their aircraft attacked piecemeal, uncoordinated, and were destroyed piecemeal. The technology that enabled American naval air defense was essentially the same VHF radio concepts that transformed bomber escort over Europe. Different implementation, same principle. Coordinated forces defeat uncoordinated forces when all other factors are roughly equal. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently identifies radio coordination as a critical factor in Allied victory. Not the only factor, industrial production, manpower, intelligence, and countless other elements all mattered. But coordination enabled everything else to function effectively. You can produce 1,000 aircraft, but if they can't coordinate their operations, they're far less effective than 500 aircraft that can coordinate. You can train the best pilots in the world, but if they can't communicate during combat, they're vulnerable to inferior pilots who can coordinate their attacks. Technology matters, tactics matter, training matters, but coordination multiplies the effectiveness of all those factors. The men who flew with SCR-522 radios in 1944 and 45 recognized this. Their memoirs and interviews consistently emphasize how different the air war felt once reliable communication became available. Not dramatically different in obvious ways. Aircraft still got shot down, missions still failed, men still died, but subtly different in ways that added up to decisive advantage. You could warn your wingman about an attack he couldn't see. You could call for help when you were in trouble and actually receive help. These seem like small improvements. Individually, each one is small. Collectively, they transformed warfare. The legacy extends to the present day. Every military radio system used by modern forces traces conceptual ancestry to the VHF coordination systems developed during World War II. The frequencies have changed. Modern tactical radios operate in VHF and UHF bands with digital encryption and frequency hopping to prevent jamming. The technology has advanced. Solid-state electronics replaced vacuum tubes, digital signal processing replaced analog circuits, satellite communications supplement line-of-sight radio. But the fundamental concept remains identical. Give every unit the ability to communicate clearly, reliably, and instantly with other units and commanders. Coordinate operations in real time. Share information immediately. The SCR-522 couldn't do many things modern radios can do. But it proved the concept worked. It demonstrated that coordination multiplies combat effectiveness. Every tactical radio network deployed by military forces today embodies lessons learned when engineers finally built radios that worked and doctrine finally acknowledged that coordination matters. Yet the 3-year gap between solution and implementation haunts this story. Between 1940 and 1943, while American forces struggled with inadequate radios, the proven solution operated successfully in British aircraft. The British offered to share the technology. American engineers were capable of manufacturing it, but institutional resistance delayed adoption until the body count became impossible to ignore. How many of the 21,000 American aircrew casualties in 1943 could have been prevented if VHF coordination had been adopted earlier? We can't know precisely, but we know that lack of coordination was a primary factor in mission failures throughout 1943. We know that after VHF became standard in 1944, coordination improved dramatically and loss rates decreased substantially. The correlation suggests causation. Better radios enabled better coordination, which reduced casualties. If better radios had been available earlier, casualties would likely have been lower earlier. This isn't merely historical speculation. The after-action reports from 1943 explicitly identify communication failures as contributing factors to mission losses. The reports from 1944 note successful coordination. The difference was VHF. The men who died in 1943 died in part because of institutional failure to adopt proven technology. That failure wasn't inevitable. It resulted from human decisions. Commanders who refused to question doctrine. Planners who prioritized pride over effectiveness. Administrators who delayed adoption of foreign technology because it was foreign. These were choices. The men who died because of those choices deserve to be remembered. Their deaths should teach us something about the cost of institutional pride and bureaucratic inertia. The photograph of that radio technician working in a shipping crate repair shop captures this truth better than any strategic analysis. That young man, hunched over an SCR-522, ensuring it works properly so pilots can talk to each other when they need to. Most, he represents the thousands of people at every level who actually made coordination work, not the generals who eventually authorized adoption, not the planners who finally changed doctrine, the technicians who maintained equipment, the engineers who designed it, the factory workers who built it, the pilots who used it effectively. These people, most of them anonymous to history, enabled Allied victory. They did so despite institutional failures that delayed giving them the tools they needed. There's profound irony in this story. The British developed VHF radio for defensive purposes, coordinating interceptors during the Battle of Britain when they were fighting for survival. The Americans took that same technology and turned it into an offensive weapon, coordinating attacks deep into Germany. Same frequency, same basic radio design, completely different philosophy of use. The British needed coordination to survive. The Americans used coordination to dominate. Both applications were effective. Both saved lives. Both contributed to Allied victory. But the conceptual difference reveals something about institutional thinking. The British, desperate and under attack, tried anything that might work. The Americans, confident in their doctrine and industrial capacity, resisted adopting technology that contradicted their pre-war assumptions. Reality eventually forced change, but only after thousands paid the price for institutional stubbornness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.